I guess this'll do for a few days, I muttered to myself, staring at the quaint little cottage. My buddy had hooked me up with a gig to house-sit while the owner was out for the week. Sure, the idea of staying in some old lady's musty house didn't exactly thrill me, but the money was too good to pass up. Walking up the stone path toward the house, I had to admit, the yard was impeccably maintained. That was especially impressive, considering the owner was blind. I chuckled at the thought. Obviously, she must have hired someone to keep everything looking this good. The only thing that felt a little off were the two garden gnomes flanking the path. Both of them had these wide, unsettling eyes that seemed to follow me as I walked by. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Shaking off the weird sensation, I knocked on the front door, even though I knew no one was supposed to be home. After waiting a minute with no answer, I was relieved, no awkward small talk to endure. I bent down, pulled back the welcome mat that read "Home Sweet Gnome," and fished out the spare key she told me would be there. When I stepped inside, I was immediately greeted by another one of those grinning gnome statues, this one holding up a tray like a butler. How many of these ugly things does she have? I muttered under my breath. As I wandered through the house, I noticed it wasn't just the yard that was meticulously maintained. The entire place was spotless, not a speck of dust, not a crumb out of place. The kitchen counters gleamed, and every single item was neatly arranged. The only thing that looked slightly out of place was a note sitting on the coffee table. It was a typed list of instructions, laying out everything I needed to do in excruciating detail: what day the trash went out, how to tend to the roses in the garden, you name it. Honestly, it all seemed way too micromanaged, but one thing caught my attention. At the very bottom of the page, there was a handwritten note that read, "Leave the house as you found it." At first, I rolled my eyes. "Yeah, thanks for the tip, lady," I grumbled, irritated that she'd felt the need to write that out as if I didn't know how to do my job. But as I stared at the note again, my annoyance faded, replaced by a weird, uneasy feeling. That line at the bottom, written in shaky handwriting, didn't match the neat, typed text above it. Did she write it herself? And if she didn't, who did? I shook my head and tried to shrug it off, deciding to unpack and settle in. I hauled my duffel bag to the bedroom and tossed it onto the bed. Glancing around, I noticed the room was pretty sparsely furnished, with plenty of open space around the huge king-sized bed. A fainting couch and a makeup table sat along one wall, while a bookshelf lined the other. That's when I froze, my hand still clutching my bag. Perched on the bookshelf were two more gnomes, staring straight at me. One dangled its legs playfully over the edge, while the other stood with its hand shading its eyes like it was surveying the room. "You've got to be kidding me," I groaned, shaking my head in disbelief. "There's no way I'm sleeping with those creepy things staring at me all night." Determined, I grabbed them both, one under each arm. They were surprisingly heavy, and their awkward shape made carrying them a pain. Huffing and puffing, I lugged them to the back door. As I set them down to unlock it, I noticed something odd: a pet door, the kind you'd use for a dog or cat. The detailed instructions hadn't mentioned anything about pets. Maybe she'd taken her pet with her. Either way, it wasn't my problem. Stepping out the back door, I stopped dead in my tracks, my mouth practically hitting the ground. Scattered across the garden, tucked between vibrant rose bushes, were dozens of garden gnomes. Each one seemed to be frozen mid-action, one balanced delicately on one foot while watering the plants, another, shirtless and flexing, gripped a pair of gardening shears. No matter where I looked, another gnome would pop into view, each posed uniquely. It was overwhelming. Did she have all of these custom-made? I wondered out loud, shaking my head. This lady must have more money than she knows what to do with. I glanced down at the two gnomes I'd carried outside and shrugged. "Well, fellas, looks like you're joining your buddies. There's no way I'm letting you creepy guys hang out inside with me all week." With that, I dropped them into the nearest patch of mulch. Feeling oddly triumphant, I headed back inside, glad to have gotten rid of those unsettling statues. I barely spared them another thought as I lounged around the house, taking it easy. At one point, I glanced at the ridiculously detailed list of instructions but figured skipping one day wouldn't hurt. Who'd even notice? The rest of the day passed uneventfully, and as night settled in, I made my way back to the bedroom. Before climbing into bed, I gave the room a quick once-over, double-checking for any stray gnomes I might have missed. Just the thought of waking up to one of those bizarre grinning faces gave me the chills. Thankfully, my search turned up nothing, and feeling reassured, I flopped onto the giant king-sized bed, ready to drift off. But sleep didn't come easily. The old house was alive with strange creaks and groans, every noise snapping me out of the edge of sleep. Just as I was starting to relax, I heard it, soft footsteps coming from the kitchen. Throwing off the covers, I grabbed a flashlight. "Please don't let it be a raccoon," I muttered under my breath, kicking myself for leaving the pet door open. Bracing for some wild animal to leap out at me, I tiptoed toward the kitchen, shining the flashlight around. To my relief, everything seemed in its place. I started to feel silly, thinking maybe the noises were just my imagination. But as I turned to head back to bed, the flashlight beam caught something. A pair of gleaming eyes stared back at me from across the room. I let out a yell so loud I startled myself, flinging the flashlight into the air. It clattered to the ground, spinning and rolling to a stop on the tile. My heart was pounding as I slowly stepped back, eyes fixed on the spot. The flashlight beam landed on another gnome. This one sat on the counter, chubby and smug-looking, dressed like a chef. It clutched a rolling pin, smiling at me with unervingly bright blue eyes. I stood there, frozen, as an irrational feeling crept over me, like it was watching me, almost taunting me. "Are you kidding me? How did I miss another one of these things?" I groaned, running a hand through my hair. This lady has zero taste in decor. Snatching the gnome off the counter, I marched back to the back door, yanked it open, and hurled the statue into the bushes with all the frustration I could muster. Satisfied that I'd dealt with it, I locked the door and headed back to bed, determined to finally get some rest. I did manage to sleep, but it wasn't exactly peaceful. When I woke up, groggy and annoyed, the thought hit me, whatever I was being paid for this job, it wasn't enough. That's when another idea crept into my mind: what if I helped myself to something around the house? She wouldn't even notice, I chuckled to myself, amused by the thought. She's blind, what's she gonna miss, anyway? The memory of last night flashed through my mind. Speaking of which, I muttered, I should probably check and make sure I didn't break that ugly chef gnome. On his way to the back door, I rummaged through a few drawers and closets, hoping to find something of value. My search didn't yield much, just a couple of gold trinkets sitting out on the jewelry box. Smirking to myself, I pocketed them. "A little bonus for my trouble," I muttered. Feeling pretty pleased, I opened the back door to check on the gnome I'd tossed out earlier. What I saw made me slam the door shut instantly. All the gnomes had been moved. They were no longer scattered throughout the yard but clustered right there by the door as if waiting for me. For a moment, panic set in, and wild thoughts raced through my mind. Were the gnomes alive? Out for revenge? I quickly shook off the ridiculous idea. Get a grip, I told myself. It's just some dumb prank by neighborhood kids. Still, the thought of how long it must have taken to move them all back made me feel exhausted just thinking about it. Determined not to let it ruin my day, I brushed it off and flopped onto the couch, scrolling through my phone to distract myself. I just started to relax when I heard an odd sound coming from the kitchen. It was faint, but unmistakable, the soft swish of something plastic and the gentle click of the pet door. My eyes widened. "Oh, come on," I muttered, realizing I'd forgotten to close it again. Annoyed, I stormed into the kitchen, ready to chase out whatever critter had snuck in. "Great," I grumbled. "If she didn't have pests before, she sure does now." The kitchen was empty, save for the swinging flap of the pet door, letting me know I was just a second too late. Fueled by frustration, I threw open the back door to catch the intruder. The door slammed against the house with a loud bang, rebounding shut behind me. I barely noticed the noise. What caught my attention was the sharp, unmistakable click of the lock engaging. I spun around and grabbed the handle, yanking it desperately. It didn't budge. "Oh, you've gotta be kidding me," I groaned, panic setting in. All thoughts of chasing the intruder vanished as my brain zeroed in on one horrifying realization: I was locked out. Frantically, I tried to remember if I'd locked the front door earlier. If I had, I'd be stuck outside all night. In my panic, I failed to notice something far more alarming: the gnomes were gone. The garden, once swarming with them, now looked pristine and empty, the rose bushes standing untouched. The eerie emptiness didn't register as I bolted around to the front of the house, praying the door was still open. Reaching it, I grabbed the knob and twisted, nearly collapsing with relief when it creaked open. "Finally, my laziness pays off," I muttered, exhaling a deep sigh as I stepped inside. My relief was short-lived. Something on the floor caught my foot, sending me stumbling forward. I tried to recover, but my other foot smacked into something solid, sending a sharp jolt of pain shooting through my toes. I crashed to the hardwood floor, gasping for breath. Groaning, I twisted around to see what had tripped me. My stomach churned. Sitting in the middle of the floor was another gnome, arms spread wide in a mocking pose, its face twisted into a devilish grin. Scrambling backward, I tried to put distance between me and the creepy statue, only to freeze. For more gnomes were lined up in front of me. What the heat! Before I could finish, a thunderous crash erupted above me. A bag of flour fell from seemingly nowhere, landing inches from my head and exploding on impact. White powder filled the air, coating everything, including me. My eyes stung as I tried to blink away the flour, but it was useless. Coughing and squinting, I froze again, this time at the sound of something even worse: soft, scuttling footsteps, closing in from all directions. Panic surged as I swung my arms wildly, trying to fend off whatever was out there. My hand smacked against something fleshy. Without thinking, I grabbed it, only to feel sharp teeth sink into my skin. "Ah, what the hell?" I screamed, flinging my arm in a frantic attempt to shake off whatever had bitten me. The teeth let go, but things were far from over. Voices began shouting all around me, high-pitched and taunting: "Hold him down. Gouge his eyes out. Bite him again. Kick him, lads." A barrage of kicks, jabs, and punches rained down on me from every angle. Small hands grabbed at my arms, trying to pull them away from my face as I desperately tried to shield myself. Fueled by adrenaline, I lashed out, flailing my arms and spinning wildly in every direction. My chaotic movements managed to push back the attack, but it left me dizzy and disoriented. Still blinded by the flour, I had no idea where I was or what I was fighting. A hail of small objects pelted me from every direction, leaving no room to think. Instinct took over, and I bolted blindly, choosing a random direction in my desperation to escape. I'd barely made it a few steps when something clamped onto my leg. I kicked and thrashed, trying to shake it loose, but the added weight made me stumble, slamming my leg into a bookcase. The jolt nearly sent me crashing to the floor, but sheer panic kept me upright, just in time for my face to collide with a wall. Dazed but still conscious, I groped along the wall, my hands searching frantically for a doorway. My attackers were closing in fast. Finally, my fingers found a knob, and I ducked into the room, slamming the door shut behind me. Panting, I pressed my back against the door and wiped at my flour-caked eyes. Tears streamed down my face as I clawed the powder away, clearing my blurry vision. When I could finally see again, I realized I'd made it back to the master bedroom. Relief turned to horror as I looked down. Clinging tightly to my leg was another gnome, its twisted face frozen in a hideous sneer. I bent down, preparing to smash the thing to pieces, but a heavy pounding on the door stopped me cold. Scrambling, I fumbled for the lock, twisting it into place just as the crashes against the door grew louder. The whole frame shook with each impact. My back slid down the door as I desperately scanned the room for a way out. My eyes landed on the bedroom window, and hope flared. I raced over, yanking the curtains aside and peering into the yard. It was empty. Perfect. Clawing at the window, I tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Closer inspection revealed it had been painted shut, the dried paint sealing it tight. No, 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 I muttered, panic creeping back in. I braced myself beneath the window, using every ounce of strength to push upward. My arms shook, my face flushed red with effort, but the stubborn window refused to give. As I craned my neck back for leverage, something caught my eye. A gnome. It was diving off the nearby bookshelf, aimed straight for my head. Its pale surface seemed to ripple midair, crackling and hardening into stone just as I spotted it. I barely had time to react. My hands fumbled helplessly on the window, unable to shield my face. With a sickening thud, the stone figure slammed into my skull. Pain exploded through my head as I crumpled to the floor, warm blood pouring down my face and blinding me once again. Gasping, I forced myself to my hands and knees, my head pounding as I struggled to rise. I braced myself, ready for the weight on my leg, but something was wrong. The gnome that had clung to me earlier was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the room. Where had it gone? Before I could answer that question, a loud click and creak filled the air. My stomach dropped. I spun around in time to see the bedroom door swinging open. Two gnomes had worked together, stacking on top of each other to reach the handle. The door now stood wide open, and the hallway behind it teemed with gnomes. They charged into the room, brandishing kitchen utensils and tools like weapons. I swung my arms and kicked wildly, but it wasn't enough. The gnomes swarmed me, surrounding me in a tight circle. Tiny hands grabbed at my arms and legs, stabbing and jabbing until my knees buckled, sending me crashing back to the floor. The tiny attackers showed no mercy. They danced around me with twisted glee, raining blows on my crumpled body. The room echoed with their shouts, "Get his legs! Smash his face! Stab him again!" I tried to fight back, but the relentless assault was too much. My vision blurred, my strength drained, and the world around me grew dim. The last thing I heard was their high-pitched, maniacal laughter. Underscore 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 underscore. The gnomes didn't stop their grisly celebration until one of them clapped its tiny hands together, silencing the room. "All right, lads, clean up time," the leader barked. With military precision, the gnomes sprang into action. A group rifled through my pockets, retrieving the stolen jewelry and returning it to its rightful place. Another team strung a rope around my lifeless body, dragging it out of the bedroom and through the house. Outside, a crew of gnomes stood waiting by a freshly dug hole near the rose bushes. Without ceremony, they rolled my body into the grave, shoveling dirt over me until the hole was filled. Their task complete, the gnomes marched back to their spots in the yard, posing once more as innocent, lifeless statues. The house fell silent. By morning, it was as if nothing had ever happened. A few days later, the old woman returned home, weary but content after her week away. As she stepped through the front door, the soft scent of roses greeted her, their fragrance masking any hint of the chaos that had unfolded in her absence. She set her bag down and made her way to the living room, sinking into her favorite chair with a satisfied sigh. "Welcome home," came a small, cheerful voice beside her. "How did Trevor do while I was gone? Did he manage to take care of things properly?" The gnome perched by her chair crossed his tiny arms and rubbed his stone-like face. I told you already, we can handle everything ourselves. That kid was a disaster. He trashed the place, but don't worry, we cleaned it all up before you got back. Well, that's a relief, she replied with a chuckle. The gnome smirked. He was so clueless, he even left you a thank you note before he left. Oh, how thoughtful, the woman said warmly. Why don't you read it to me? The gnome cleared his throat dramatically and held up a crumpled scrap of paper. In a sing-song voice, he began, Dear Mrs. Everett, thank you so much for letting me stay in your lovely home. It was truly an unforgettable experience. Please let me know if you need help again in the future. Best regards, Trevor. The old woman laughed softly, shaking her head. Well, it's nice to know he was grateful. The gnome muttered under his breath, grateful, sure. Let's call it that. As the old woman relaxed into her chair, she reached down to pat the gnome's head. You all really are my most reliable helpers. I don't know what I'd do without you. Anything for you, ma'am, the gnome said, grinning up at her with a mischievous sparkle in his eyes. Outside, the rose bushes swayed gently in the breeze, their roots entwined with the secrets buried beneath them. The house stood silent, serene, and undisturbed, just as it always had.